The first book of Adam and Eve, otherwise known by its wordier title, The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, picks up after Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, covering their struggles, temptations, and the events leading up to Cain killing Abel. It describes their first home, the Cave of Treasures, their encounters with Satan, and the births of their children, including Cain, Abel, and their twin sisters. It's an account that allows us to sit with Adam and Eve in a time that's unfortunately glossed over in the traditional Genesis account, a time where we learn how they managed on the earth after their expulsion, and what trials and tribulations came their way when the ground was cursed, and when only thorns and thistles were produced. Many scholars classify this book as part of pseudepigrapha, a collection of ancient texts considered outside the biblical canon, often dismissed as fiction. Because of this, the book of Adam and Eve was left out of the Bible. Still, despite being labelled pseudepigraphal, it provides fascinating insight into early traditions about Adam and Eve's lives, such as their mourning of the paradise they had now lost, the introspection of what they had done, and lest we forget the continued tests of Satan. In fact, you might say that if it were mere myth, with no deeper significance, then it's hard to imagine why it would have been preserved for so many centuries thereafter. Could it be the case that this alternate, somewhat scandalous version of the events in Genesis is that much more tantalizing that it persisted throughout the ages? Or was this truly the reflection of an ancient people who viewed such a narrative so drastically different from how it's viewed today? Like many ancient texts, the book likely began as an oral tradition, passed down through generations before eventually being written down. The version we have today is thought to be the work of an unknown Egyptian writer, estimated to have been authored within a few centuries before Christ was born, based on similarities to other pseudepigraphical writings. Some parts of the story also appear in the Jewish Talmud and the Islamic Quran, showcasing the broader influence that this version of the narrative would come to have. Indeed, whilst the book of Adam and Eve would naturally be rejected and otherwise shunned by the modern believer, it does nonetheless prove to be quite the intriguing read, where it allows us to consider a reality of what might have transpired between Adam and Eve after they'd been banished from the garden, and how it was far from plain sailing. From the onset, the narrative deviates from its biblical counterpart, giving us some interesting nuances about the actual creation of the world. We are told that it was on the third day that God planted the Garden of Eden in the east of the earth, and that beyond this garden there was nothing but water, an expansive ocean that encompassed the whole world and even reached the borders of heaven. Indeed, already, the narrative showcases something different than what the common believer would come to expect. Biblically speaking, God didn't create the garden until after the seventh day, where the world itself had already been created and the waters and the sky had already been given their places. Yet in this narrative, we are led to believe that the garden was the primordial land, the very first mass of earth that was placed in the easternmost area amongst an endless ocean. One finds nothing but water that encompasses the whole world, the text reads, signifying the utter barrenness of the world except for these very waters and the small chunk of land that God had now caused to emerge. Now, of this water, we are told that it was clear and pure to the taste. It was unlike anything else we know of today in terms of its purity, and had such divine properties that one could see the depths of the earth just by staring into it. Furthermore, we are told that if a man was to wash himself in these waters, he would become clean, not just of body, but of all sin, regardless of how evil he had once been. This, we are told, was the Crystal Sea, a primordial sea that God had made with the sole purpose of allowing humanity to bathe and cleanse themselves of the wrongs they had committed. Just as they washed away dirt from their bodies, so too could the wickedness of their deeds and actions be washed away too. Whilst the canonical Bible does not explicitly mention such a crystal sea, there are passages that do describe similar imagery found much later in the book of Revelation. The Apostle John witnesses a sea of glass in his visions, telling us in two accounts that also in front of the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal, and then again I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast. Indeed, these accounts do echo what we read in chapter 1 of the book of Adam and Eve, a sea so clear as crystal that one can see the depths through it, and a sea that promoted the righteous and the holiest, only those who could have been victorious over the beast. Whilst it's a stretch to conflate the two accounts with that of a crystal sea found in the book of Adam and Eve, it is interesting that these bodies of water are given such significant detail. Now, the book of Adam and Eve tells us why such an ocean was created by God in the first place, and interestingly, we learn that this was for his own good pleasure, a poetic irony that God himself could later enjoy. You see, the text tells us here that God knew Adam would end up transgressing, and he knew that he would boot Adam from the garden after the great disobedience took place. In a way, the text almost styles this creation of the waters as a cruel quip by God, who lets it be known to his creation that there is a cure for their sin, but the only way to get there is to venture north of the Garden of Eden, where man is barred from entering. With this elaborate scheme, it does beg the question, was humanity set up to fail? Indeed, God is seen here to have created the crystal sea before Adam had even sinned. The text also tells us that God knew Adam was going to sin, yet he never grants him access to the waters that would have saved him, but in a way lords it over him, allowing him to know of its existence but never giving him the opportunity to redeem himself. In that way, it might be said that man and Adam were made to suffer, the cure dangled almost ungraciously before our faces, yet forever out of reach, a constant reminder of our original sin. On the other hand, the text does also reveal to us that when the righteous have died, God will raise their souls on the final day, whereby they will return to their flesh and be granted access to the crystal sea, where they may bathe in the waters and repent of their sins. In this regard, it might be said that yes, God did set up humanity to fail, but that this in itself allows for man to prove himself worthy of returning to paradise. Thanks to Adam, paradise is no longer a gift to humanity, but rather something that needs to be earned, and can only be earned by being a good person during one's mortal life. Only then can man be truly cleansed in the crystal waters, whereby he is returned to his maker to live eternally in bliss. Adam and Eve had the burden of receiving the punishment firsthand. They were not only dismissed by the source of all that was holy, but they were also denied by him personally. It's reasonable to believe that Adam and Eve did know about the crystal sea, and may have even expected to have been taken there to resolve their transgression. And yet, the text tells us that God went out of his way to remove Adam and Eve from ever even glimpsing the sea in their mortal lifetime. We are told that when God banished Adam and Eve from the garden, he did so with quite a lot of thought as to where he was sending them to. The text tells us, he did not place Adam on the border of Eden northward. This was so that he and Eve would not be able to go near the water where they could wash themselves in it, be cleansed from their sins, erase the transgression they had committed, and be no longer reminded of it in the thought of their punishment. Indeed, God in this narrative is seen to preempt Adam and Eve. He knew they had gained knowledge from eating from the tree, so once again, it is reasonable to suggest that they had probably come to learn of the crystal sea. Perhaps this became a part of their logical strategy to either outsmart God and maintain their place within paradise, or was a means to hide their sin from God by washing it away before he had the chance to see it. In any case, we know that they were not successful. In fact, it's entirely possible that they hadn't even got that far into realizing such a devious plan. All the text tells us is that God knew not to place them north of the Garden of Eden, because this is where the crystal sea was, but that he also knew not to place them on the southern border of the garden either, because he didn't want the wind, which blew from the north, to bring them the sweet, delicious smell of the trees. Put simply, the text aims to highlight God's disapproval with what man has done, and seeks to exemplify not only God's wrath, but the magnitude by which he meant for them to suffer. They were not allowed near the crystal sea, that much was obvious, but they aren't even allowed to smell the trees of the garden. They are afforded no vestige of the paradise they once beheld, and are enveloped within the misery outside of the garden absolutely, where nothing grows, the land is barren, and man must ultimately fend for himself. In some ways, it runs parallel to the Genesis account, where God's anger toward Adam is painted quite vividly through his detailing of his punishment. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. Yet this chapter in the book of Adam and Eve does not conclude without reminding readers of God's mercy. Indeed, he had blocked Adam from venturing north of Eden, where the crystal sea was, and he prevented Adam from venturing south where the winds would carry the garden scent. But he allowed Adam to venture west of the garden, where we are told that the earth was very broad. Whilst the advantage is quite vague here, it might be said that the land west of Eden, the remainder of the earth, was more than Adam could ever ask for. True, it was a land that had been cursed by God to produce thorns and thistles, and Adam would have to work the land tirelessly to yield results. But it was enough to sustain his life and the lives of his descendants, tiresome and grueling though it may have been at times. In the final verse of this chapter, we are told of yet another deviation from the traditional Genesis account, where Adam and Eve aren't left to their own vices on the earth, but instead given some direction. We don't see this compassion from God in the Genesis account. Indeed, he is seen to give them garments of skin, so that they can clothe themselves, and this is seen by some to be the last kindness of a parent to their wayward child. Yet to others, it comes across as more of a professional courtesy, the duty of an employer handing their disobedient employee their severance pay. After this, God isn't seen to give any guidance to Adam and Eve as they settle on the earth, but rather takes further precautions against them by employing a cherub with a flaming sword to guard the way back into the garden. Chapter 1 of the book of Adam and Eve, meanwhile, tells us that God advised Adam and Eve to live inside a cave, the Cave of Treasures, that was below the garden for a time being. We aren't given much detail as to what the Cave of Treasures is at this stage of the story, though it becomes clearer by chapter 3. From this standpoint, we are led to believe that the cave was something of a transitory space, a halfway point between the ease of paradise and the harshities of the new earth. Essentially, by this narrative, God was not as cutthroat as to throw Adam and Eve into the barren world to fend for themselves, but rather was compassionate and merciful enough to allow them to transition gradually. In comparing chapter 1 of the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan to the Genesis account of creation and the fall, it becomes evident that these texts present markedly different portrayals of both the narrative and the nature of God. Genesis offers a concise, structured account in which God's role is authoritative yet distant, focusing on creation, command, and consequence. In contrast, the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan expands upon the aftermath of the fall, with a deeply emotional and dramatic depiction, emphasizing Adam and Eve's suffering and God's continual intervention in their plight. Rather than the more distant and sovereign deity of Genesis, this apocryphal text presents God as compassionate, involved, and even sorrowful over humanity's suffering, frequently communicating with Adam and Eve to guide and console them. While Genesis primarily establishes the foundations of sin and redemption in broad strokes, the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan seeks to explore the psychological and spiritual struggles of the first humans, offering a different perspective that paints the protagonists in a more relatable yet incriminating light. It's with such differences that highlight the evolving nature of religious thought and storytelling, revealing how later interpretations sought to deepen the emotional and moral complexities of the Genesis narrative. As always guys, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.